Penetrating Shot is the longest range rogue build in the game, but even with that said, it's not as true of a sniper rogue build as I personally prefer. But today, I wanted to show you my newest variation of Penetrating Shot that solves some of the problems you've all brought to my attention in previous versions. Some of the biggest problems were boss damage and consistent AoE. Specifically, sometimes in packs you're left with a few mobs that feel annoying to deal with because you have to use an entire pen shot to finish them off. Well, today I've addressed those problems and wanted to make an update to the Penetrating Shot rogue build. In my videos, I leave all the show and tell about the skills and the Paragon board towards the end because I don't believe you need to sit through a 30-minute explanation of all the choices made to be able to play the build. However, there are some things you really do need to understand, so let me break those down. First, let's take a look at the overview of the skills we're using and talk about the purposes each of them serve. For the primary spender in this build, we're using Penetrating Shot. This should be no surprise because this is our main source of general AoE damage and is going to be the heart of this build. For our basic skill, we have Puncture to generate combo points, which is going to enhance our spender skills. And I want to mention, if you want a more true sniper-esque build, you could take Forceful Arrow, which can be nice to group enemies for a huge penetrating shot, but in most cases, I prefer Puncture because it's much more dynamic and it's a faster skill to use. Now, for our next skill, to address the problem that many people have expressed with my previous pen shot build, I found a way to work Rapid Fire into the build per suggestions from the previous comments. Now, if you are wondering, this has replaced Poison Trap for my previous builds, and Rapid Fire is a very nice skill to have for priority damage if you need to kill a shield minion, a healthy boss, or kill an elite who has Suppressor. Overall, this skill adds a lot of valuable single target damage to the build and makes it feel much stronger. Then for my primary movement skill, I've chosen Shadow Step. For me personally, this skill has always felt the best. I can use it to get out of a tight corner, escape from crowd control, and honestly, I can use it to get out of just about anything. Now, Shadow Step's not for everyone, and I get that, so feel free to absolutely use Dash, Concealment, or Caltrops for your movement. The choice is up to you. All three work just fine. And for the final skills, this shouldn't be a surprise, but I'm still taking Shadow and Poison Imbuement. The logic for this is that, in my opinion, the physical damage of Pen Shot is just underwhelming. Even if you change your entire Paragon and shift your entire focus of your build to physical damage, it doesn't feel as impactful as it does with Imbuement skills. Now that I've broken down the skills, I want to talk about the specific aspects that you need to know if you want to find the most success with this build. So the first aspect we're using in this iteration of the build is Edge Masters. All this aspect does is amplify your damage based on the amount of energy you have. For example, if you have 50% energy and your Edge Masters is on your weapon, giving you an additional 40% damage, since you're at 1/2 energy, you'll get a 20% damage boost. If you're at 100% energy, you gain 40% damage boost, and etc. It's pretty simple. The next aspect I've weaved into this build is Arrow Storms. This aspect helps solve a single problem we have with this build, clearing off the stragglers. Using an entire pen shot to finish off a couple of small mobs after killing a whole pack feels really unrewarding. So after testing out this aspect, I find that it helps killing off some of the stragglers in different packs of mobs, and overall, it's a very nice source of additional damage. The final aspect you need to understand to make this build shine is Trick Shot. Most people understand the basic premise: 2 arrows shoot from each side of the initial pen shot upon impacting a target. Pretty simple. But you might not understand how to best utilize it. Because of the massive AoE potential of this aspect, you want to make sure you're using Penetrating Shot in a tight clump of enemies. This is why grouping is such an important skill needed for this build. The more enemies you can get grouped in a tight area, the stronger the explosive potential of Trick Shot can be in combination with your imbuments. So, now that I've done an overview of the skills and the aspects, if you're wanting to see an entire list of the skills, Paragon board, stat weights, and aspects, I'm going to cover those at the end of this video. Additionally, I also am going to have a completed D4 planner as always, so you can easily transfer everything to your in-game character. But in these videos, I think there's a lot more value from actually seeing the build in action and learning about why it works the way it does, rather than hearing me explain how valuable Weapon Mastery is or the logic behind Stutter Step. But if you do want to hear that, it's also going to be at the end. Now I want to talk about a few key things you need to understand, first being the core damage loop. So your key skill rotation in this build is going to look something like this. You activate an imbuement, use Puncture 3 times for combo points, then use Penetrating Shot if you need massive AoE damage, or Rapid Fire if you need some priority single target damage, then Puncture 3 times, use the spender of your choice, and then activate your next imbuement. Now, that's the core damage loop, and now I need to talk through 3 of the things that you should keep in mind while playing this build. First, you need to understand your imbuments. You should understand the purpose of them and what they're used for primarily. For example, Shadow is the best for AoE situations because of the explosion, and Poison is extremely valuable for amplifying the damage of your single target skills. Next, you might wonder when to use rapid fire. So the largest problem that has plagued my previous penetrating shot builds, especially if you're using it to try to push higher level content, is your ability to kill shield minions and priority targets. Having rapid fire in the build allows you to do this very quickly. Additionally, if you ever get isolated damage on an elite, rapid fire is the go-to option. This next one is a comment I get all the time. I have energy problems. What do I do? Well, there's a few things you can do. Since we're running Edge Masters, ideally we want to be as high on energy as possible at all times. If you find yourself running out, because we've taken improved rapid fire, you can use rapid fire as a way to get energy back, which is actually really nice to have. But you also don't want to be constantly needing to do this, otherwise you're not really benefiting from Edge Masters. So in my opinion, it's important to get boots with energy cost reduction, a maximum energy stat line on your helmet, and if you really need it, you could also take energy cost reduction on your amulet, but that's probably overkill. So this seems like the most natural place to move into the gear required for this build, but I want to break down 4 stats we want anywhere possible, then I'm going to move into key stat lines on each piece of gear independently. So the 4 key damage stats you want anywhere possible on your gear is vulnerable damage, crit strike chance, crit strike damage, and crit strike damage with imbued skills. Those 4 stats are going to amplify our damage the most. I also want to mention that crit strike chance is important because it's going to determine how often you're getting a massive explosion from pen shot. Alright, so when it comes to the gear, I'm going to go through all the pieces here really quickly and talk about the most important stat lines. All my gear, decently optimized. I am level 100. I have been min-maxing my build pretty hard. But if you are curious, the perfect best in slot rolls on the D4 planner, they actually added a new feature where I could go in and I could put stats in on each of the pieces of gear. So if you want to know my ideal, what I would want to have in a perfect scenario, that's also included on the D4 planner. But anyway, going back into the build here. For the helmet, the most important 2 stats here are cooldown reduction and then ranks of shadow or poison imbuement. Those ranks make it so we still get to feel the impacts of the enhanced imbuement skills without having to actually put the points into them. So for me, I really like that. Also, like I mentioned earlier, if you do struggle with energy, you can get a maximum energy roll on your helmet as well. So that's something to keep an eye on if you are running out of energy consistently. Then for my chest piece, I'm running the aspect of might on it, and we have damage reduction, total armor, percent damage, and then ideally I would change that shadow damage to something like dodge chance, damage reduction from close or distant enemies, and something like that. Then for the gloves, mine are pretty best in slot. The only thing I would really change here is if I wanted to, I could change lucky hit chance to critical strike damage with imbued skills, but that would be an ideal best in slot situation. These gloves are great, and I'm not going to complain about them. The biggest thing you want to make sure about on your gloves is that you have those 4 ranks of penetrating shot, because as I'll show you here in the abilities, if you actually get the additional points into your skill, you notice here the base scaling of the ability is higher, so any of the amplifications on top of the base scaling are going to make the damage of pen shot that much more strong. It's probably confusing if you're newer to Diablo, but just trust me, these 4 ranks into your skill are very important. Anyway, moving into the pants, again, on your pants, you want to make sure you only have defensive stats. Ideally, you would want total armor, damage reduction, and then damage reduction from close or distant enemies. And then for a 4th stat line on this, you can also get imbuement skill cooldown reduction, which is a very nice to have if you can find it. Then for my boots, right now I'm running the Penitent Greaves, but I've also explored running Mangler's Aspect on the boots. The boots are really up to you, but if you do have boots that aren't Penitent Greaves, I would go with movement speed, energy cost reduction, and then the last 2 stats can be like dexterity or dodge chance, something that's defensive or offensive, completely up to you. Now, I get this question all the time, are bows viable? And in my opinion, you can use them, but I think crossbows are just much better because that 60% vulnerable damage baseline stat is very, very valuable. So without that stat line, if I'm running a bow, for example, I find myself hitting much lower numbers, and for the pen shot build specifically, that's going to hurt your output substantially. But anyway, for other stats on the 4 stat lines below the vulnerable damage, I have additional vulnerable damage, I have dexterity, basic skill damage, and then critical strike damage with imbued skills. So the only thing I'd like to change here is I would change that basic skill damage to core skill damage, and then you could also change that dexterity to critical strike damage as well. Then for my first dagger, I have Condemnation, so my stats are locked on this. If you don't have Condemnation, just follow my advice here on this sword, so your second sword would have mirrored stats ideally. So my favorite rolls on a sword are vulnerable damage, core skill damage, crit strike damage, and then critical strike damage with imbued skills. Again, it can be really hard to get a best in slot like that. You can see here my sword, not best in slot by any means, and I'm still clearing content just fine, so you don't have to have best in slot. I just want you guys to know what the most important stats are. So then for rings, you're going to want the stats to be the same on both, and I'm going to actually show you my best ring here, which is this one. We have critical strike chance, crit strike damage with imbued skills, and then vulnerable damage. Now, I'm not going to lie to you guys, this ring is insane, and I didn't find it until probably my 1000th run of a dungeon, so rings like this don't come around very often, so if you can't find one this good, don't feel bad, very normal. But anyway, moving on to the amulet. On your amulet, in my opinion, it's important to make sure you have imbuement skill cooldown reduction or just flat cooldown reduction and then percent damage. The other two stats are completely up to you. You could go with damage with marksman skills, damage with ranged weapons, you could go with ranks of imbuement skills, ranks of exploit, ranks of malice. There's so many options on an amulet that it's really hard to give you a best in slot recommendation, but the two stats I think are the most important are percent damage and then cooldown reduction. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. As you all know, I don't mess around with wasting your time. I try to get through all the useful info as fast as possible and save you time. Hopefully you've all enjoyed this video, and if you want to stick around to copy and paste my skills and Paragon points from the in-game screen, that's going to play once I'm done babbling here. But anyways, as always, thank you all so much for watching. My name has been Valued. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.